Welcome to the S.O.A.P video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We are coming toward the end of the book of Leviticus. We have 2 sessions left, just a handful of chapters. And I hope you've been enjoying this. I hope that you have found some things that you were expecting, but also some things that you were not expecting as we've gone through it.
Yeah, and that should always be the case, right? Yeah. So last week we got into a bunch of laws, right? And there was laws.
As we should.
Exactly. Right. And there were laws for the common people, and then there was laws for the priests, and it all kind of revolved around God saying, "You must be holy because I am holy."
Yeah.
And we kind of kept coming back to that statement, and that was kind of cool. So this week, we're kind of expecting the same thing, and it's completely different in chapter 23. So in chapter 23, starts out the same way. God tells Moses, go tell the Israelites, and here's what you need to say. And basically, there are 7 times in a year when the nation of Israel needs to assemble, needs to come together as a nation for a celebration.
Yeah, take a pause,
is kind of cool.
Think of something specific, celebrate something specific.
Yeah. So this whole chapter is about each one of these.
Yeah.
And guess what? There's different rules for each one, right? And you can read through the rules, and that's fine. But the first one is the Sabbath itself, right? So every week there is a Sabbath.
Yep.
And that was celebrated on Saturday. I finally got that right. I generally always say Sunday. On a Saturday, and the idea is a day of rest and no work.
So what's interesting is that
work, right?
No work. But most people think of this today because of how Christians do, church and Sunday and everything, that the Sabbath was a day of worship. And by the time we get to Jesus' time, they would gather in the synagogue or whatever, but that's not how it was originally.
It was literally
structured.
A day of rest.
It was just a day of rest. It was your day off. It was your weekend.
Yeah.
It was your weekend. You work for 6 days and then you take the day off from work.
Right.
But it wasn't, a day of worship. It wasn't a day of prayer. There was
That's
no
interesting
church
because I assumed
service.
I assumed it was worship.
No, because their worship at the tabernacle was regular. That was on an ongoing basis. They were doing offerings and sacrifices, and God's presence was right there with them. They didn't need a time of 3 million, 10 million people getting together, right? So it was a day off of work.
Yeah. I thought you were going to key on the word work, because with every one of these, the big question is work.
Yeah.
Some of these are no work, some of these are absolutely no work, and others are some work.
Yeah, right.
and it's like the biggest difference in there. And if you think about it, if it's a day festival, okay, no work makes sense. If you have something that goes along for a week, it's really hard to say no work for an entire week.
Yeah, and this really was, and we use the term weekend for Saturday, Sunday, because this was the end of the week. That's really what it was. You work for 6 days. It's patterned after the creation week. God created for 6 days, and then he ceased from his work. He didn't take a nap, whatever. But he just ceased from his regular daily work. This is not the first time this shows up. It actually showed up. The Sabbath was even before the 10 Commandments. It goes back to Exodus 16, even before the 10 Commandments. So this has been a part of what God has wanted them to do, but he's officially codifying how it works.
Right. The next one is Passover, and then always getting added into that is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread.
Yeah, the following week. Yeah.
So I just want to talk through it for my benefit, because maybe you have the same questions too. But the whole idea with Passover is celebrating when they were in Egypt. They put the blood over the door that told the angel of death to pass over this door or this house.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the firstborn male was going to die.
Yeah, which could be both the father and the son. If the father was the firstborn, like I am. Right. In my family, had I not done that, it would have been both Nathan and me who would have died. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, interesting. So that's a one day festival, and then that goes into the Feast of the Unleavened Bread.
Yeah.
And my understanding is, so while they're in Egypt, this happened.
Yeah.
And it was, we now have a chance to go. Grab up everything, let's go. They didn't have time to make bread.
Yep.
So, or bread with yeast because it took time. So they made unleavened bread.
Yep.
So it's the celebration of Passover, but different.
But it not just so Passover was the celebration of
the actual
event. Passing over of the event.
Yeah.
But then it was Passover, that first Passover in Exodus, that then they left Egypt. So this was, they had to take bread with them or food with them that could travel too.
Right.
So this next week, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was celebrated not just the Passover, but the actual Exodus of leaving.
Okay.
And this was the beginning of their sacred year. They sort of ran on two calendars that were 6 months apart. There was their sacred calendar and there was their civil calendar. Passover began there. It was the first of their sacred year.
Okay. The next one is the presentation of the first fruits, which is the day after the unleavened bread. We have 3 holidays all right next to each other, right?
Yep.
Right? Okay. And this is a wave sacrifice.
Yeah.
Which just seems odd to me, right?
I mean, literally waving, waving it in the air.
It's taking it to the priests, and the priests are doing the waving in front of God or in front of the altar, and then they give it back.
You actually a lot of times you get to participate in eating it. It's like a festival or a feast. Yeah. The word feast is in Hebrew also means festival or party, like celebration. So
Well, we're getting to a big one there because it's now we're on day 7, 8, 9. Right of festival. So the next one is the Feast of Weeks, which I'd never heard of it that way, but Pentecost.
Pentecost, because Pentecost, Pente, P-E-N-T-E, Pente is Greek for 5.
Right.
So Pentecost is 50 days, but it's the Greek name. The Hebrew name is actually the Feast of Weeks because it's 7 weeks after Passover.
Okay. So 49 days.
So if you're 49, 50 days,
So this is a requirement of men to physically come into Jerusalem every year?
Okay. Jewish men from all over the world. Passover is one, Pentecost is another, the Feast of Weeks is another, which is why and they would basically plan to be there for 2 months almost if you had to travel in. So the same people, let's say Acts 2, the same people who heard Peter's message on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2 were there 50 days earlier when Jesus was crucified at Passover. It was the same crowd of Jewish men who were there to worship. And this is the Feast of Weeks. This is sort of the early harvest. We're celebrating the early harvest, not the fall harvest, but the spring harvest. So the wave offering, the Feast of First Fruits, and the Pentecost both sort of celebrated
together
these things that God was giving them early in the year.
Okay, the next one is the Feast of Hornblasts, which I've never heard in my life, except it's also called Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah,
I've heard it that way, but in seeing it spelled out, it's like, I'm not pronouncing it right.
No, you've probably also heard it as the Feast of Trumpets.
Yeah.
And so then that translation of horn blasts, it's, trumpet blasts or whatever. Yeah.
So what's this one about?
This one is actually, Rosh Hashanah means top of the year. So this is now their
new year?
civil new year. Rosh Hashanah is the civil new year.
So would it be at midnight they're blowing trumpets?
I don't know if it was at midnight, but
or whatever. The 6 p.m. Right?
The shofar, the horn, the ram's horn trumpet. And they're celebrating their new year.
Okay.
And it's about 6 months apart from the first month. It's the 7th month of. He said it's in here it's the 7th month of the year. Well, how is it the new year if it's the 7th month of the year? Well, Passover is the first of the sacred year. Rosh Hashanah is the first of the civil year. Yeah.
Okay. Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur?
Yom Kippur, 10 days into the new civil year, we have this. So we've got Passover at the beginning of the sacred year, and we got Yom Kippur at the beginning of the civil year.
Yeah, and we've talked about that before. The nation of Israel and the head priest atoning for the nation.
Yep, the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, and then the last one, the Feast of Temporary Shelters.
Yeah, or Tabernacles. Some people, the Feast of Tabernacles.
So for 7 days, and the men have to come back for this one. one too,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So for 7 days they need to live in tents.
Yeah.
Does that still happen?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. If you look at Jewish holidays even today, it's called Sukkot, Sukkot, because that's the Hebrew word for tent. And what they'll typically do, I think the rule is that it has to have at least 3 sides. It's either 2 or 3 sides and some kind of roof on it. And yeah, you can see them either in Jerusalem. You can see people who are, say, Messianic Jews, or they want to celebrate these things here in the States. I have friends who build little shelters, and I don't know if they necessarily camp for a week out there, but they might. They'll eat outside and celebrate God's. It's sort of the end of the harvest. They're coming to the end of the growing year, and it's a reminder of where a Passover and unleavened bread reminded them of the Exodus and coming out of Egypt. This is a reminder that God had them living in tents for a while before he gave them their land. So it's a celebration of the temporariness and the receiving of the land.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great.
So it's really cool. You can see these are spread out over about 6 months, from our March, April to September, October. Mm-hmm. You've got all these going through.
Okay. So we get into chapter 24, and the new revelation in chapter 24 is we need to have a lamp. And this lamp needs to be in a specific place, and it's outside of the special curtain in the meeting tent, and it always has to be burning.
Yes.
Right. So it's up to the priest to make sure that the lamp is filled with oil.
Yep.
And it has to be 100% olive oil.
Yep.
That's in there.
Yep.
And this is called a perpetual state throughout your generations.
Yeah.
So I assume they're not doing it now because there is no temple.
There's no temple, right?
Right.
So when this is where Hanukkah comes from.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Because this would be the
menorah.
lampstand, the menorah.
Right.
So under Antiochus Epiphanes, he desecrated the temple, right? And then there was the Maccabean revolt, and you can look at Jewish history for all of that stuff. But the fire went out on the lamp, and they did not have enough oil to burn for more than 1 day. But it was going to take a week for the oil to be blessed and the whole thing, where it was purified so that it could be in the lampstand. But they only had enough for 1 day. So as the story goes, that 1 day's worth of oil burned for 7 or 8 days until they had enough where they could replenish it. Right. Yep. This is also the same thing that when Jesus was in the temple in John chapter 8, and he pointed at the light, and it's burning, everything. He said, "I am the light of the world." That was the same. It wasn't this one, because that was probably destroyed. Solomon made a new one, a big one, whatever. But this is what he was talking about. He pointed to the menorah, the candle, the candle stand in Jerusalem there. He pointed at that, and then he said, "I'm the light. Nice. I'm the light of the world."
There's also a bread table.
Yeah.
Right? So the bread table's for priests to eat in God's presence.
Yep.
So a lot of things we've been talking about is priests getting fed a number of different ways.
Yep.
So with this, they need to make, I believe it was 12 loaves. They all had, there were specific, use this much flour or wheat, whatever was in there. It needs to be replenished on a weekly basis.
Yep.
And the loaves needed to be set out special.
Yeah.
Why? He was pretty specific.
Very specific, because everything in the tabernacle, in the temple, was supposed to be done in a very orderly, specific, thought out way. Yeah. They weren't allowed to just throw stuff around, because God wanted to keep it very solemn, right? He wanted it to be, he didn't want, it goes back to, "You be holy because I am holy," right? He didn't want them to be flippant about what they were doing there. It's a very serious work that the priests were doing, standing between God and the people. And so everything had to be done just right.
Okay.
Yeah.
In this chapter, there's a second part. and in the second part, two men get into a fight.
Yeah.
And one man is native Israel, and the other isn't. His mother is, or his dad is, and his dad's Egyptian. Yeah. And one of them uses the Lord's name in vain.
Yeah.
Right. And in Exodus 27, it says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold guiltless anyone who takes his name in vain."
Yep.
So the guy was arrested, was detained. They went to God and says, "What's going to happen?" And God says, "This guy needs to be put to death."
Yeah.
It's kind of scary.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
It was a big deal.
And God does make a big deal of it from the standpoint of, look, this doesn't matter if he was a natural citizen or if he is a resident foreigner, right? Somebody who's half in there. Either way, the answer is the same, right?
Yep.
They need to be put to death.
Yep.
So this led into other laws that are in there too, and some of these are famous. I mean, you would have heard of it: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right?
Yep.
It shows up a lot. But the idea here is, if someone inflicts a beating on another person, that same beating should be inflicted upon them, or could be inflicted upon them.
Yep.
That seems fair, but it also seems like we twist it a lot.
Well, it's justice. I mean, that's the thing.
Right.
Is you need to determine with animals, for instance. If you kill an animal, you have to pay restitution.
Yeah.
If you beat a person, then you need to suffer the same thing.
Right.
That
and literally, if you knock their tooth out,
you
your
get a
tooth is going to be knocked out.
Yeah.
Right.
Now you see this in some religions today. Islam does something similar. In the United States, our law code doesn't work exactly this way, but even our justice system does try to have some kind of restitution. Right. God just laid it out very clearly. If you do this, this is what you have to pay. We talked about this, plus 20% or whatever. What I find interesting here is if you kill an animal, you have to pay for it.
Yeah.
If you kill a person, you die.
Yeah, well, you pay for it with your life.
You pay for it with your life, but it's not just paying restitution. God placed a higher value on people than he did animals.
Yep.
And that's something that definitely we've gotten twisted in our world today.
Yeah. So we moving on to chapter 25. So we're familiar with the Sabbath, right? That day of rest,
yep,
type of thing. And this chapter brings out that the land also needs a Sabbath.
Yep.
Right. So the land needs rest.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, right? If you're farming a land year after year and you're not replenishing the nutrients, that land's going to go bad.
Right.
Right. So the idea is that you can farm it for 6 years, and on the 7th year, that land needs to rest.
Yeah.
Now I'm assuming that it wasn't this part. I'm assuming everybody was running on the same calendar.
Yes.
Right. So on the 7th year, nobody's doing.
Right.
Right. So a lot of questions come up, right? Because of course, right. I don't plant anything that 7th year. Corn from the 6th year grows again and comes up. Is that legal to eat?
Yep.
Right. So a lot of questions like that.
Yep.
What about grapes? Grapes seem to have a special difference in there.
Yeah. The key to the Sabbath, the key to the weekly Sabbath was you're not going to work 24/7 because you have to trust that I will take care of you.
Yeah, same
thing.
Right?
You're not going to plant the 7th year, so yeah, you may get some leftovers the 7th year from the 6th year, but that 8th year, you're not going to have anything.
Right.
You'll be planting, but you're not really going to be having much of a harvest yet because you didn't plant the 7th year. You've got to trust that I can give you enough the 6th year to get you through.
Yeah, 2 years.
2 years basically, to the eighth year, that first new harvest. So again, it's always about trust. It's always about dependence. Right. If you thought a weekly Sabbath was weird and strange, wait till you get to your yearly Sabbath type thing, and then now we have a new one.
Yeah, next is something called the Jubilee.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the seventh.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, the 50th year, which again has it's sort of like the Pentecost. There's an annual Pentecost, 7 weeks between Passover and Pentecost. Now we've got 7 sets of 7 years that were, for Jubilee.
Yeah, so special things happen during the Jubilee, and the one that was different for me or odd for me is there's a land reset.
Yeah.
So you could sell me some land, and I'm happy. This is my land. I'm living on it. Blah blah blah. You hit the Jubilee year, the land goes back to you.
Yeah.
So I'm not really buying it.
Nope.
But if you think about it, the land's God's.
And that's really the big key that comes out of here that we forget a lot, is that the land really doesn't belong to Israel. So when Israel's in war, when they talk about two-state solutions and all this stuff, it's not really Israel's to give away. They sort of have it on lease. God owns the land. He's letting them use it. It's a perpetual thing for Abraham's descendants, through Israel. But it's really God's land. And when he says, I'm parceling this part out to your tribe, if you sell it to somebody else, fine, you get to farm it for a while, but it's going to revert because it's still God's land, and it still is Judah's, or it's still Naphtali's, or it's still whatever.
Yep. And I know what you're thinking. Ooh, what's the cost in there? But God says in the Bible, if you got a long ways to go to the Jubilee, you should pay more.
That's right.
And you should.
It's really a lease or a rent
exactly.
is what they're doing. So, if Jubilee's next year, you're going to pay next to nothing for this because you're not going to have it very long.
Right. And of course, it's not as easy as that, right? Because some things adhere to the Jubilee and some things don't, and I'm not even going to get it.
Yeah, we don't because really today, first of all, it's not going on the same way as it was. Because this is part of the old covenant. The old covenant's done. The old covenant's been broken. Israel's not living under this anymore anyway. So in a sense, it's somewhat superfluous, but we still should read it. We still should understand.
Yeah, it's still cool.
That God
well,
put this
and this
stuff
I
together.
believe comes up again maybe next week.
Yeah.
Too. So it's important you know it then.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So
there's obviously a lot that we didn't touch in.
Yeah, and there's some detail. I think some of the more so some of the stuff in chapter 26, chapter 25 is sort of like, okay, that's interesting. Maybe you're not as interested in that as the festivals or the feasts, and we spent a little bit more time on that because
what are they and why
and some
of
that is still being done today. And the church, there are certain parts about the church that we do have today that seem to fit on certain Jewish holidays. Jesus was crucified at Passover. The church began at Pentecost. Some of that stuff we do still see today. So you may find that a little bit more interesting. Regardless, it is important. We're only a couple of chapters away from the end of Leviticus, and we'll finish that next time. Until then, share this with friends and family. If you have questions and comments, absolutely love to hear those from you, and we will respond to you. So enjoy, and we'll see you back here next time.
Bye.